Hi virtual design students, welcome. It's Mrs. Hinch and let's get started on our new project. We will be making abstract watercolor designs. Now this is a really fun project because you get to play around with watercolor potentially for the first time. And for those of you who have worked with watercolor before, it's going to help harness your motor skills with it, to be able to manipulate the color a little bit better. And also, we're bringing in a little mixed media into this because once the watercolor is dry, you will be going over top with marker, fine point Sharpie if you have it, ink pen if you don't, and adding outlines to your color as well as patterns similar to the very first project that we did, the expressive line drawing. So creating lots of different line examples with your fine point Sharpies. All right, let's get started. So first thing to note here is my setup. I've got my watercolor paints, my paper ready to go. I have several different brushes, and I've got a cup of water as well as a paper towel. More than likely you will be using this to get rid of extra water or pigment from your brushes. But I just wanted to point out the difference between using smaller brushes or using wider brushes. Obviously, they're going to have different effects for different brushes, but for this project, we do want to keep the designs quite small. Obviously, you want to fill the whole page, but you're probably going to want to avoid big brushes like this. So I'm just going to set that one aside and I'm going to work with these two smaller ones. First, I'm going to dip my brush in a bit of water, get a nice amount, and then I'm going to take my brush directly from my water over to my paint palette. Now these watercolors need to be activated with water. Some different watercolor types come in little tubes that you then dilute in water. So whatever you're working with, most of you will probably have something like this. If you don't have a watercolor set, you can accomplish this project by using water-based markers. So I've got some of your traditional Crayola markers, and I also have one of the more professional Blick markers. So I'm going to go ahead and just start with my Crayola marker, and I can use this to make cool shapes and color that in. And then what I'll do is use my paintbrush, dip it in a bit of water, and you can actually move some pigment around, which creates a watercolor effect. All right, so there are ways around it for those of you who don't have the materials that you might need, like a watercolor set. For this, I'm going to work in a slightly analogous color pattern. And so by that, I mean I'm using neighbors on the color wheel, so you all should be really familiar with what I'm talking about here. And you should be able to hopefully note what I'm creating here as far as my color palette, right? So I've got my blue, I'm working with a little green here. I'm going to actually mix the two and try to create a blue-green. So just because you don't have the exact color in your color palette doesn't mean that you can't mix two of them to create the full analogous color spectrum that we're looking for here. Another example of this, I'm going to take this green one that I did at the very beginning, and I want to add a little bit more of this color scheme. So instead of just having analogous colors around each other, you can actually have them fade into one another within the shapes that you're painting. So I've already got my green, my light green, my yellow green. Now I want to come in with my regular green, my secondary green, and I'm gonna have this turn into a slight gradient from green to yellow green to yellow. So I'm picking up some yellow on my paintbrush now, and I'm just letting it sort of merge with the green. What I love about watercolor is that it's actually quite forgiving. So if you ever put a bit of color down that you really don't like, the best thing that you can do, I'll do this with a little bit of green here. Let's say I put that down and I don't want that there. So I've just marked up my paper with this bit of green here. I've got my paintbrush pretty wet, not super wet to the point where there's a drip coming off it, but wet enough. I'm going to basically lightly brush over the color a couple of times, and then use my paper towel to gently dab at the pigment and pull it up. You don't want to scrape across, because what's going to happen is your paper will start to get sort of like fuzzy, which we want to avoid. So eventually your painting gets to a point where you're just sort of going through what you have down on the paper already, and you're looking at the empty space, and you're just sort of following the lines and using them almost as a coloring book, really, to sort of guide your next shape. So I'm just kind of gonna go in between these blues here, and I've picked up my nice red violet, my fuchsia, and I'm playing around with shapes. And I'm just gonna fill up my entire paper with these little abstract shapes until I've got not a lot of white space. Okay, you shouldn't have a lot of white space any bigger than an M&M. Alright, so now that I have my watercolor finished and I have waited for it to dry, that is key. You cannot begin the next step of this, the line work, until your paint has dried. Whether you used marker or traditional watercolor, things need to be dry in order for you to put ink on top of them. So I have here a ultra fine point Sharpie, which are pretty common. And then I also have a micron pen. I'm using a 03. So I'm gonna just start with the Sharpie since that's a little bit more common. And I'm gonna go in with some really detailed line work and try to sort of create a little more visual interest in my design. So I'm gonna start by outlining my shapes. I don't have to do all of them, but sometimes it's nice. And from here, I'm just gonna go in and start to create different detailed line designs. You want to make sure that the marker that you're using has lots of ink to it so that it shows up very well. And if you get started and you realize that your painting isn't as dry as you thought, just stop, pause, wait 20 minutes, come back to it. You don't want to rush this process. It will ruin your creation. And maybe I want to switch it up now. So if you need any inspiration for your designs, just look up mandalas. I know I gave you that example when we were starting the expressive line project, but there are a ton of great line examples online when you look at mandalas. They're also just really therapeutic to look at. I think that's why they make a lot of coloring books out of them. So this whole process should take you quite a while. I do want to see a ton of detail. So similar to our example here, you are expected to be creating some pretty intense detail here. And the more love and effort that you put into these, the better the outcome is. So don't rush through it. Really take your time and let this be a really fun, intuitive process for you. Have fun!